Welcome everyone to the faculty and the students for the inaugural virtual information session for the Johns Hopkins University and American Enterprise Institute Graduate Intellectual Diversity Initiative. And it's just great to have all of you here. We have a great number of interests from a group of faculty, 30 and more now, and a group of students that is just growing both in our official pool of mentors and mentees, and just a listserv that grows with people at various stages in their early 20s mostly, who are eager to learn about what we're doing here at GSIDI. And so I'll just give a brief word of introduction about what this program is and myself. So my name is Jacob Brueggemann. I'm the executive director of the initiative, working with Steve and Jenna, who will introduce themselves in a moment. The initiative is premised on this, I think, issue that we're all kind of increasingly aware of, which is that academia has an intellectual diversity problem. And I think it's increasingly evident to many of us on campus, but also in the wider society, that regardless of our political persuasions, there are serious consequences to this intellectual diversity problem. And so the Graduate Student Intellectual Diversity Initiative, in its first year, coming out of a partnership between Hopkins and AEI, is dedicated to helping broaden that intellectual diversity in the American university by matching elite mentors in this year, political science and political theory, with students coming from a variety of professional and intellectual backgrounds in the modern United States. And so we're really excited to have a great group of 10 and potentially a few more students who are in the mentorship track. So these are for students who are actively applying to
programs in political science. We'll match them
with mentors, some of whom are on the call today, and I'll introduce them in a moment. And then there's a broader community of students that we have in our programs. And these are students who maybe want to come to or get recordings of calls like this, students who are maybe grad school curious, but haven't decided if they want to go to graduate school or maybe what field they want to go to graduate school in. And so there are two broad communities that we're serving: students applying in this cycle and in the sort of future immediate cycles, and then broadly students who are just interested in higher education and academic life in the United States. And so before I introduce the faculty, Steve and Jenna, would you like to introduce yourselves and fill in anything I've papered over regarding GSIDI and the program and the kind of philosophy of the work we're doing?
Hello, I'm Jenna Story. I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, co-director of the Center for the Future of American University, and also working with Steve and Jacob on the Graduate Student Intellectual Diversity Initiative.
Yeah, I'm Steve Tellis. Since 1994, I've been teaching political science. As of this year, I'll be in the School of Government and Policy at Johns Hopkins, and I'm also a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center. So I can also speak to sort of hybrid careers you can do with PhD, both in academia and in the think tank world.
Great. Well, without further ado, let's turn to our faculty panel. So we're very lucky to have with us today Allison McQueen, Daniel Carpenter, and Sean Gallimard, all of whom are part of this growing faculty network we have for the virtual information sessions like this and potential other types of programming down the line, and then may work individually with students, some of whom are on the call, who have applied specifically to our mentorship program. So let me just introduce them briefly. Allison McQueen is the Nahal and Jenny Von Raj Civics Faculty Fellow in undergraduate teaching and an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Stanford. Thanks for being with us. Daniel Carpenter is the Ali S. Freed Professor of Government and Chair of the Department of Government at Harvard University. Thanks for being with us, Dan. And Sean Gallimard is the Herman Royer Professor of Political Economy and Vice Chair for the Department of Personnel at UC Berkeley. So thank you all three for being with us in this inaugural kickoff call. It's excellent to have you here. And so let's just jump right into a question I think is on a lot of our students' minds. And so they're coming from a variety of intellectual, disciplinary, undergraduate degree programs.
Some are going to be in stages of their
professional career after their undergrad degrees. And so if you're going to give advice to students at that stage, what can students do in the final 2 years, let's say, in their undergrad programs or in intervening professional lives? We have a lot of students who are RAs at think tanks, for example. What can they do in this period to sharpen their applications for PhD programs at schools like Berkeley, Stanford, or Harvard? And feel free to just jump in, and then Steve may jump in and ad-lib a little bit too, but whoever wants to take that first.
I mean, I'd be happy to kick things off. Two things come immediately to mind. If you're an undergraduate student, or if you have an ongoing connection with an academic institution, or this applies to certain think tanks as well, working with a professor or some other professional on research to just get a taste of academic research and the practice of academic research, because getting a sense of how professionals do it is very different than the kind of research you do for a standard undergraduate paper. It's related, but especially if you're interested in the empirical fields, getting a taste of research design, data collection, coding data is really important. It's also really important for seeing whether this is the path for you as well. So if there's an opportunity for you to get involved in that kind of research, that would be both really informative and also really great practice for you. The second thing I would say is start making it a practice to read academic journals the other end, when it's done, when it's polished, when it's gone through a lot of feedback and peer review. And one of the things you want to do is shift your mindset from the mindset you use as a student in an undergraduate course, which is, what is this paper arguing? What is their research strategy? What is their methods? Where does it leave itself open to criticism? The kind of stuck questions you'd have to ask as a consumer of research to debate it and discuss it in a class. You don't want to turn that part of your brain off, but you want to activate another part of your brain too, which is, what is this author doing? Or what are these authors doing? How do they set up the question? What maybe drove them to choose this question rather than that question? How do they draw other people in to be interested in the question? I'm an editor right now at American Political Science Review, and that's a lot of where submissions hit a stumbling block, right? Is assuming everyone should be interested in their topic. And the best submissions are the ones that can make a pitch for the interestingness of the question. And so you want to be reading not only with the what part of your brain turned on, but the how part of your brain. And that is the easiest path, to my mind, to starting to formulate your own research questions in a way that's compelling, is starting to absorb some of those moves almost by osmosis, which you will do if you consume academic journal articles with both the what and the how parts of your brain turned on. So those are all just things I wish I had done prior to applying to grad school. So I'm not saying everyone has it nailed, but if you do it now, you'll have a leg up, I think.
I'll say just a couple of quick things. One, also a thing you can do, especially if you're still an undergraduate, going to department seminars, especially if you're at a more research-oriented university, to see what that particular kind of conversation is, because, the reason we do all this kind of work is that we're trying to say something about the world. But when you see people actually doing it because it's their day job, you see that, there's a lot of like inside professional stuff, right? Like, people are arguing over methods. They're arguing about, rationale. There's a lot of things that are not totally visible when you see the end product. That's worth seeing, and it's worth seeing whether you want to have that. Academic is both a combination of someone with some kind of spark of genius and then just a lot of slow boring of hard boards. And if you're not really up for that, sorry, that was a thing I threw in for Allison, I think, the Weber reference there. So I think that's important, just to see if you can imagine yourself in that. I want to double click on one of Allison's points, that the more that the people who write letters for you can actually get rid of the degree of projection that the grad school admissions committee has to imagine, right? If they're like, this person actually wrote a paper with me, and I can tell you that they've got the chops, they've got that this isn't just somebody who's promising, but I actually saw them do something like this. Those are always the best letters, right? And the ones that are very specific, like that. They're like, admit somebody and then be like, oh man, this person didn't really have it, and now we're stuck with them for 5 years, right? You want somebody, where they're like, okay, I know this person can do it. So that's really a lot of the purpose of the letter writer, is to reduce the uncertainty on the part of the graduate committee, and anything you can do to help them with that job of reducing the uncertainty is really valuable.
Allison, that was fantastic. And Steve, that was a great follow-up. I think, where people often have difficulty in grad school is not so much with the courses for the first couple of years, but transitioning from courses to producing scholarship. And so I think a lot of what Allison and Steve just said, I don't think we usually learn that somebody, it's not so much that they were not cut out for grad school or things like that, but that they're not going to sort of engage in academic pursuits. We don't often learn that in the first year or two of grad school, but by the time they're supposed to be shifting their focus to a dissertation and they are seemingly unable to do so and unable to get active in the space of sort of academic production, if you will, that's when we often find these things out. Maybe there were signals early on, but sometimes not. I would say the other thing is, it is a good idea, and I think Allison hit on this very clearly. It's a good idea to be clear-eyed about kind of what you're getting into. So there's a process, and it can be very tedious, and it can be very boring. And I think this is true not just in the empirical sciences, but also in political theory and in areas that kind of overlap. There's a saying in sort of among those who write journal articles that the last 10% is 90% of the work. So the amount of time that I spend and my co-authors spend responding to reviews is immense. In fact, I spend probably more time writing the response to the reviews from me to, say, reviewers at APSR, somebody else who said, assuming it even gets past the initial stage where I actually get to revise and resubmit, I'm going to spend a lot of time, revising those folks. And I spend maybe more time on responding to reviews than the actual text. Now, you could say, well, that's a horrible equilibrium we live in, and we ought to change that. But it gestures to the truth of what a lot of this is about. And I write a fair number of academic monographs, and I can tell you that that's also true with monographs. Maybe not quite as much, but I have to spend a lot of time responding. And so, if you are up for a career of, if you're going to be writing where you're spending your Saturdays or Sundays, depending on your chosen Sabbath, or weekends or nights, responding to critics of your work in a very formulaic manner, if you're up for that, then this job is for you. If you're not up for it, just learned. And revising is really that is what writing is, I think, in many respects. But it's a particular kind of set of steps that one has to walk through when you are in academia. And it does vary. I think, Allison and Steve were probably pointing to what I would say the modality is, at least in political science, which is some form of at least partially, often dominantly quantitative political science research. But there's other, and what I mean by that is empiricist, but there are other forms. Sean does a lot of work in applied game theory and formal modeling, mathematical modeling. Similar processes have to be done there. When I've published work that uses historical data, including archives, things like that, I'll get a lot of questions on, the particulars of those that I have to respond to. Increasingly in political theory, not least because you're starting to see a whole bunch of general political science journals like the APSR and increasingly the AJPS publish political theorists, and it means that they have to actually now go through a lot of those same steps.
These are great points. I probably don't have anything really insightful to add, but as to that last couple of years or that last year for an undergraduate or a working professional, I would encourage that person to think clearly and carefully about what do they want to get out of this? Why do they want to do this? What kinds of questions do they want to answer? And explain that in the statement of purpose or the research statement. I would say specifically in my department and the deliberations that I'm part of for graduate admissions, we don't look at research or statement of purpose as a proto-thesis prospectus. It can often seem like that's what we're demanding of undergraduates is propose your thesis topic. You've never gone through the formal education in this field. We often deprecate at the undergraduate level certain parts of that education, say, don't do that. Just take the quantitative, methods. And so what are they supposed to tell us? They want to write. So that's a real bind, that people can be put in. And the fact that it's a bind, that binds are unfair doesn't mean that we don't have them. We do. But that's actually not how my department and my colleagues evaluate these statements. I'm more interested in understanding what kinds of broad forces do you think go together? What kinds of questions do you want to answer about how the political system works? And that sense of thinking of the political system as a system, that analytical sense that we can study the world in this way is useful to see. I completely agree and echo the point made about, familiarize yourself with currents in the disciplines conversations. I mean, research fields are kind of ongoing asynchronous conversations. Journal articles and books are contributions to to those conversations. So what conversation do you want to be a part of? It is difficult to see the path for a prospective graduate student who wants to say things that may be interesting but are not part of an ongoing conversation. It's like walking into a party and you just start talking. Even if you're saying really interesting things, that's not necessarily how conversations start. When you walk into, so you kind of, read the room a little bit and see what you can participate in. That is, sociologically speaking, an important part of how we construct our disciplines. And, at some point we can think about whether that's optimized or not, but that is the way that we do it. And it's important to see how students will work in that system that we've built. I would also say, this is probably well known to a lot of people interested in this call, but some degree of familiarity with the methodological side and techniques and sort of foundations of how we do empirical research in political science is particularly important. That's not in my department. That's not essential for students who specialize in political theory, but it is essential for anybody in the empirical fields of the discipline. Have, no familiarity and no connection to how empirical research is actually like the techniques and the types of fields that are involved in it raises a higher bar and more questions about how's this person going to do here? Can they handle what is going to be thrown at them? Are they prepared for this? Do they understand it? So I intend to enable, not to scare off, but simply a class on research methods, a class on statistics. Anything is useful, relative to a baseline of, very low exposure that people often get as undergraduates. So I would really encourage those elements. And I think that's kind of what I have to say about that.
So I am a political theorist, but I'm a political theorist in an unusual department where there's a small number of theorists, and the climate of the department is very much that the theorists are pretty well integrated into a heavily empirical and, also quantitative methods driven department, some formal methods as well. But I would say that I think even if you're considering applying in political theory to a program, maybe not everyone on this call is, but maybe some of the people who watch it later will be, programs differ in terms of what they expect from theory applicants. Stanford expects our theory applicants to do a 2-course sequence in quantitative methods along with everybody else. And so that is somewhat unique. I'd urge you to think about the long game. And the long game, hopefully, is if you do have an academic career, that you will be in a department where theorists are not the majority, right? Where many of your colleagues are doing empirical work and really interesting empirical work. And having both the skills and the interest in that work to be able to talk to your colleagues makes for a much better professional life. than considering yourself to be, I don't know, the last bastion of humanism in a social scientific department and always in a defensive crouch against the onslaught of quantitative methods. I think it would be sad to end up that way. And you guys have a real opportunity, if you're thinking of becoming political theorists, to sort of cultivate an interest and an ability with empirical colleagues right now. And so this just reflects my perspective as a theorist. I can't say this would be a widely shared perspective among political theorists, but I think that's worth investing in early. And that may include even in programs where you don't have to take the quantitative methods sequence. Why not consider taking it anyway? So you can be a better consumer, at least of that empirical research. It might end up mattering to your own research, but at the very least, you can also be a much better colleague to your empirical colleagues.
Yeah, and just on that, it's almost certain that you will be hired, even if you're a political theorist, that you will be hired by a department in which the people who are making the decisions are overwhelmingly not political theorists, right? And so they're going to have to think, is this person just like a write-off from my point of view? Or is it somebody who I'm gonna learn from? And I also think, it makes you better political theorists. I'll just use our colleague, Glory Liu, who's now at Georgetown, was in Allison's department. She took the statistics sequence as a great political theorist, and she often talks about how important that was, right? Part of it was she just liked the fact that she could go and say, I'm a political theorist, but I went through, the Paris Island of having to go do the statistics sequence. But I do think it's important as a political theorist, which many of the people who are going to do, not to define yourself against the entire rest of the discipline, not to define yourself against social science. You can have critiques, you can have questions about the limits and everything else. But I think it's good to try and, expose yourself. I often think people who have they think they have critiques of the rest of the social scientific and more empirical parts of the discipline, don't always know what the right critique was, right? That's the only thing I would say on that. I think Dan wanted to get in.
Yeah, I just completely agree with what Allison and Steve just said. I do want to point out the caveat that at least, and maybe it matters more to this particular audience, that the sort of the industrial organization of the sector might be changing a bit in the following sense, namely that there are all these civics schools popping up. And so you might not feel as much pressure to do that. And I guess I would still follow Allison and Steve's advice, which is to say, if you want to understand empirical research, and you want to become a better thinker, and you want to be able to sort of converse with folks across different universities, specialties, taking those quantitative methods is going to be very important. It's the same reason that we at Harvard actually have a political theory requirement for all of our graduate students, right? They don't always take the same courses, but I'm kind of glad that we do that. And so simple things like, an introductory political game theory course or introductory stats course, learning to program in R. It's amazing how much that kind of world is basically taking over so much of the social sciences. And again, you might see this as a distraction, or it's like, okay, actually now I've learned, a bit more about what statistical programming is. I'm going to better understand this crazy world we're entering with, large language models, things like, maybe you already know this stuff, but if you don't, and maybe even if you do, that kind of work will be helpful. All of you are interested in applying to these kinds of programs, and by all means do so. I would apply widely and without fear, but understand that rejection is a part of the ball game. So this is, again, meant to enable, using Gilmartian language, to enable you and not to scare you off. So of the 4 universities here represented on the faculty, when I applied to grad school, I was accepted to none of them and rejected by 2 of them. Now, I didn't apply to Berkeley or Stanford, but I was rejected at Harvard and I was rejected at Johns Hopkins. And, I eventually got into the University of Chicago, and that was great, and I really enjoyed it. But getting rejected is the other aspect of academia that you need to get used to. And in fact, it's far more draconian in other fields, where, for instance, if you're in a medical school, public health school, engineering school, you are constantly applying for grants, literally to fund your salary. And you're always getting rejected. And it's just a matter of keeping enough in the hopper to go forward. And I think that's going to be a reality of that world, even, after, this particular instantiation of the Trump administration. All of you probably went through the crazy American, college application experience. So you know what getting rejected, feels like. I just want to tell you that that's part of it. But there's there's two sayings that I'll leave you with. The last 10% is 90% of the work. And if you're not getting rejected, you're not getting published. And so, you're just constantly, that doesn't mean you send anything out according to a degree of relativism where you just don't care about the quality. But it does mean that you're constantly putting things out there, because the reality of publication is that you're going to get said no a lot. And that's also true for senior authors, maybe not as much with books, although I can cite some examples where even that's happened. So anyway.
Sean and Jenna, before you jump in, I just want to put another question on the table, which you kind of geared us towards a little bit earlier, Sean. And that's just what it explicitly makes for a really strong statement of interest or writing sample. And all of the faculty have begun to push in that direction. But just to flag that's another area where we're beginning to shade into. So go ahead, Sean, and then Jenna.
Yeah, these are great points about engagement with the empirical side of the discipline and the method side of it. Once you are on the other side of it, you've pushed through. Part of what I think we need to do for the overarching purpose of this initiative is help people see themselves in this field, as well as help people understand how to present themselves to us, so that we can make sense of them and find their path here and their applications work. We need people to see themselves in it. Part of that means having an open mind to some of these empirical and quantitative approaches if maybe you hadn't. That's genuinely, truly a good thing. I would also like to say that entering this field, even in the, quote, empirical side of the discipline, doesn't necessarily mean that you have to become that person for the rest of your career or for any of it. I would say, if anything, in my own career, somewhat strongly against that grain that I started as a graduate student, believing fairly strongly in kind of quantitative empirical approaches to learning about the world. I realized I wasn't all that good at it, and the stuff that I could do that was convincing wasn't that interesting to me, even when I was doing it, and I didn't want to do that. So I really shifted away from that approach in my own work, and I simply don't generally do it anymore. And I don't feel like I'm missing anything. I view myself as, maybe having something different to offer to those who want to read it, or just a different way of understanding how the world works that involves kind of depicting generative processes or mechanisms that can explain why do we see what we see. Engagement with the qualitative and historical data and formal modeling. So there are a variety of different paths that people can take that I think should expand how the set of people who can see themselves in this field, and that can see, like, this could be an appealing place for me.
It's very helpful if you tell the person that's helping you with your research or supervising your research that you intend to go to graduate school, or you're thinking about it, because they can start thinking about mentoring you there and thinking about the kind of letter they might write for you. And then this is to Sean's point about the statement of purpose. At least I was really working in a liberal arts school context, so I was helping students apply to graduate school rather than evaluating their applications. But I feel from a personal angle, it was very important for those of my students who are thinking about going to graduate school to take time to explain to themselves why they were interested in the questions they wanted to pursue in graduate school. Because as Dan pointed out, you're going to be up many nights, you're going to be taking time away from many other things on the weekend to pursue those questions. And part of that might be a kind of respect for your discipline, but part of it has to come from a deep desire to know the things you're trying to figure out. And I watching my students go to graduate school and looking at those who are happy and stuck with it, and those who ended up either dropping out or were unhappy with their choice, I think I could say that those who really tried to touch base with why they cared about the questions they were investigating tended to be more successful and happier with their choices.
I wanted to turn explicitly to Jacob's question, which has already been built on. I think Jenna's comments are really apt here too, because if you think about those questions, you're going to start to have the basis for a pretty compelling statement of purpose or statement of interest. I guess I'd say explicitly, what does one want to see in a statement of purpose? The thing that the biggest pitfall we see, I don't know if this is true at other places, I'm going to assume it might be, is a very biographical statement that generally starts with why from almost birth someone is known that they were at heart a political scientist or something like that. I mean, that's lovely, but I think and it's good for you to keep that in mind. But I think what we would really like to see, at least in our admissions meetings, are statements that get right to the point. What kinds of questions are you interested in pursuing? Again, to a point raised earlier, this is not a dissertation prospectus. We're not expecting you to have worked out the fundamental kind of puzzle and contribution of a potential dissertation. What we are interested in are what are the kinds of questions that grip you? Second point, why are these questions interesting and important? And there again, whatever field you're applying in, think about why it is someone who might be in some other field of political science. Like if you're applying as a theorist, why would a IR, American politics person be interested in this? Or if you're applying as a, Americanist, why should the comparative politics people be interested in this? So why are these questions interesting and important? Why should someone who doesn't share your particular subfield interests also be interested in those questions? Third, and this is where a bit of targeted biography can come into play, what makes you a good person to address those questions? What skills and background do you bring that'll help you answer those questions? And that's where some of the advice we heard earlier about working with professors on research can really come into play. If some of you have spent time at relevant think tanks or other organizations, that can also be important. That's part of your skill set to answer these questions. And then the fourth thing you want to address, and it generally comes toward the end of a statement, but it needn't, is why is the department to which you are applying a great place for you to pursue those questions? That might have to do with the fact that it has faculty working in your area. It might be that the department has other intellectual resources or programs or tracks that would help you answer those questions. But I think that's the part where you do a bit of customization to the statement as well. What is it about the institution that is drawing you there as a place to answer those questions? And I think if you get through those four, you can have a pretty compelling statement, and that is then adaptable on that last question to different programs you might be applying to. I'd say for the statement, the writing sample, you don't have, I don't know, students can sometimes end up obsessing about this, but just think about what your best piece of writing is. Think about revising it because you're now using it for a different purpose, right? You don't have to submit the exact version you submitted for a class. What people want to see in the writing sample, apart from the fact that it is technically correct, it doesn't have mistakes in it, that's the lowest bar, that it shows an ability to frame an interesting question, that whatever subfield it was written in, it shows scrupulous attention to the handling of evidence and drawing interpretations, making inferences from that evidence. And so what you want to convey, again, regardless of subfield, is that you understand some of the underlying logic of framing a puzzle and dealing with evidence and what the logic of inference is in whatever subfield you happen to be working in. And so I think it's completely okay to revise something you have that's already good with that in mind. And that's another thing, if you're already working with a professor on research, they might have the time and support for you that they could have a look at your writing sample. I'm doing this for someone right now. And just what are the tweaks that could make it shine even more on those dimensions? So those would be my main bits of advice there.
And Steve, just real quick, so to the faculty, I have to hop off to go do a Zoom interview for a position. So there are jobs for our students. There are jobs out there in this economy. But before, I just want to push the last question onto the table too, which Allison and others have also started to get at, which is the dissertation topic can be really overwhelming for students. And I think Dan and Sean have also mentioned this at different points. And especially so when you're composing these letters of interest, right? So students, I remember in my own process of applying, right? Like you're thinking, am I committing myself to 5 years of writing on a topic that I may find to be so dull and boring? And so that's often not how the dissertation topic works, right? I think it's to Sean's point about kind of sociologically placing yourself in the field and presenting yourself. But talk a little bit more, if you can, before we go to the student Q&A, about the ways that departments and advisors end up shaping in the first few years, and coursework end up shaping what actually becomes the dissertation. And that may, lessen the burden students feel when they approach this element. But Thanks so much. I'll be here with camera on.
Thank you, Jacob. So I'll take over the management of the Q&A at this point. One thing I'll say, which I think gets exactly to that point, is I certainly think it's the case that Dan and I didn't end up by the end of our graduate education doing what we thought we were doing at the beginning. I think, Dan, you started out as a political theorist, right? So did I. I learned the world definitely did not need a B+ political theorist. That was the thing I discovered in graduate school. And then I just became a grim empiricist or whatever I am now. And I think that's why, and I think everybody who's reading your application knows that, right? They know that you're however old you are. Presumably the point of graduate school is to change you in some way, right? That you're going to discover things, you're going to change your mind. And I think what's important is to get across in the letter the thing about you that's less likely to change, right? Which is, and this gets a little bit, I think, to some things Allison was saying, right? Does this person seem like they have an inquisitive, and I would say non-dogmatic mind, right? That is, and this goes a little bit to the, scrupulous use of evidence, right? Are you the kind of person who could change their mind as a result of an investigation, right? Whether it's historical, theoretical, empirical, game theory, whatever it is, right? I want to see somebody who, the New Republic used to talk about the idea of being surprisable, right? And I really like that. If somebody shows me, well, the other thing I think is, you want to get across, Jenna was making this point, right? You also want to show that you've got some, at least evidence that you could end up having very significant chops, right? And chops are very different, right? Some people it's archival, some people it's theoretical, some people it's mathematical, right? But most people who are really good political scientists have some area, or it's ethnographic, whatever that thing is, right? Most people have something that they're really good at, right? And they can really use in a way that, puts them at the highest rate of the person doing that, right? And again, that can vary, but I think between showing that you can think systemically, that you can think structurally, and you're not just going to tell the committee about all the things you care about, right? The things I've noticed a lot, I've seen a lot of applications where people go into enormous detail about what they care about and what their motivation for grad school is, right? And that's fine a little bit, but none of those things make you a good graduate student and professor, right? The thing that makes you a good grad student and professor is your ability to actually go out and investigate the world, right, with a somewhat open mind. And I think those are sort of more durable features that, that people can actually extrapolate into the future more than some of the other things we've talked about. Anyone else just on that point? Okay.
I would say,
John.
that when it comes to the question Jacob raised about finding that dissertation topic and committing yourself to it, I mean, get yourself acquainted with the field in a deep way before you, start making commitments there. Think about it a lot. In my department, graduate students aren't even committed to write a dissertation in the field in which they were admitted as a graduate student. And it really does happen that people realize as they learn the field, oh, I would like to do this other thing instead. And it sounds like Steve and Dan had that experience or something similar to it, entering as political theorists and writing a dissertation that was different from that. So allow that evolution, allow that space for, for making those pivots. And it's part of being open-minded, as Steve has said. So, but learn the lay of the land before you feel yourself really committed to that. There's some things that you really want to hold firm to. The fact of success in the art of success in academia is a mix of being open-minded about many things, but also knowing what are you going to hold firm to, that you're going to advance a perspective that's a little different than what others currently understand, but that you're going to keep pushing on. That's important too. So you want to understand what those core commitments are. What are the general points you're trying to get out of this? That's a really useful thing to have as your North Star. Specific topics, or how will I ever find a dissertation? Well, you break it into bits and you take steps along the way, and that's how.
Yeah. And again, I would just say one way to sum up some of this is show evidence that you know what it means to think social scientifically, right? And again, being social scientific is not particular to any of the subfields of political science, right? Part of that is showing that you've read rather deeply into some debate inside of social science, right? It doesn't even have to be political science, right? Lots of people who become great political scientists started out, they did undergraduate degrees in other fields, right? But you know what that looks like, and you can show evidence that you learned and you want to sort of, attain mastery of that kind of tool, which again is a different way of thinking. It's not the way most normal people think, and that you're open to becoming sort of abnormal in that particular way, right? And that where you think in terms of system structures, all those kinds of things. So before we get into questions from the students here, I just wanted to see, are there any other pieces of sort of pastoral care advice that people want to offer potential grad students here before we take some questions?
Let's get to the Q&A.
Yeah, we'll get to the Q&A. Okay. Who wants to start of the people? And I encourage the other people who aren't on video to jump on right now. Hal?
Yes, thank you all for your time and your thoughts. So a few people mentioned kind of professional experience, and I've spoken to some people who seem to think that professional experience before grad school may be in higher demand or may be more valued than at certain points in the past on an application. And so I'd be curious for thoughts about if and how and to what extent to highlight that if it's pertinent on an application. For example, by the time I would start a program, will have done long form editing for 4 or 5 years. So would be curious for insight about the propriety of highlighting that in a statement of purpose.
Yeah, who wants to take that? Allison?
I would definitely highlight it. So what you're telling me there is, you have a skill that transfers somewhat into academia. Professional editing is a useful skill to have. But even for those of you who may have some professional experience that's not in something directly related to your academic skills, it's still useful to know about. And the reason is that a lot of people end up applying to graduate school on inertia. They are very good undergraduates. And the people who are grading them and assessing them are themselves academics. And so it just the thought naturally occurs. So this person's really good at what I do, therefore they should do what I do. And so that's the students are getting a lot of encouragement without necessarily thinking, is this something I want to do with my life? And one of the advantages that applicants like you have, How, is if you spend some time outside of academia and the professional world, I think, to my mind, and I think this is true of many admissions committees, I think we can be confident you're more sure that this is a career path you are choosing. You've seen the alternative. You've spent some time out there in the non-academic world and you've chosen to come back to us. I mean, I'm a political theorist, so maybe it's some kind of variant of informed consent, or, the Amish do the Rumspringa, right? You've done a kind of Rumspringa and you've decided to rejoin the community. And so I think it has that, there's that spin that can be put on it as well.
Yeah, I should say, I think How is actually, I don't understand the process at National Affairs because they never show me edits, which is a problem and a big issue with your. So How may or may not have actually edited my pieces at National Affairs. I'm actually not aware of that. But I do think, what I was saying before is it's important to be able to think social scientifically, but it also is good to have a narrative that you were out and thought about what's important. Right. What is it, what is the thing that is an important thing for someone to study, right? To spend that time, right, in graduate school digging into with a social scientific mindset. And for me, when I was an undergraduate, I was a journalist at the very, very lowest level of the food chain. Like I was, I worked for a newsletter that went to universities who were looking for scientific research money, right? But what it meant is I was in agencies. I went into the Forrestal building and the Department of Agriculture building, and I could tell people I had an idea of what government actually looks like, and that raised questions. I had sort of unique experience that let me see something that gave me a sense of what was really important to look at. And I think lots of different kinds of evidence can show that you've got a sort of mature sense of what's important and worthy of study that you can match with your chops and your sort of systemic, structural kind of way of looking at the world. Sean?
Yeah, I think that I completely agree. If there's specific transferable skills, like both Allison and Steve are highlighting, definitely feature those. And I also would echo, there's a signaling value in deciding that you want to come back to academia and this tier of it rather than just continuing on, which can be sometimes a more straightforward choice. Although I went straight to a PhD program out of a 5-year bachelor's master's degree. That's not something I ever look sideways at when I review applications for PhD programs. And I would also say, to that point, for the most part, if the professional experience doesn't directly tie into a skill or a perspective that you will use in graduate school, don't feel the need to tie everything together as a package. I sometimes read these statements of purpose that honestly seem a little heavily parsed, a little heavily processed. Like people need to, they've been given through well-meaning advice the sense that they need to create a perfect package origin story of who they are. And all the major parts of themselves and their past needs to fit together in one act or another of their origin story. And it just sometimes doesn't look entirely convincing. And so I would say don't bother for them. I mean, listen, you finish college, you have to do you got to do something next, and sometimes it's not straight to grad school. And it doesn't always fit perfectly into an origin story, and that's okay too. And so I really don't pay that much attention, except when there's a direct transfer of skills, like you talked about with long form editing. Even then, if it's a magazine piece, that National Affairs is somewhere in between, but if it's actually like a journalism or magazine piece, it might be relevant. for what we do? Maybe not. It's not that important to me. It would be like fourth or fifth order, relevance. What I really want to see is what forces does this person see operating in the world? What things do they think go together? And what do they want to know more about? Those are first order importance. And, if working as whatever, assistant portfolio analyst for a couple of years doesn't directly tie into that, it doesn't make any difference to me. Those people have interesting thoughts too, and I want to hear them. So that's all I want to see.
Jenna?
I have a few questions, so I don't mean to jump ahead of other students with questions. If there's anyone right now, but I'll pose a couple and then see if others want to pose some more. So one of them, I have maybe one simple question and one more complicated question. At least I think it's simpler. When I was advising students to apply to graduate programs at that time, some of the faculty who were reading the essays counseled me to tell the students to put in their letters whether they were whether that particular program was their favorite program. So in other words, is it important for prospective students to signal that such and such program is their top choice or not? Or is this something I just would like an up-to-date answer to that question. And then my more complicated question is about the particular nature of GSIDI, of the Graduate Student Intellectual Diversity Initiative, because I think the motivation for founding this program and for many of the faculty and participating in it is to counter what Steve and I called field compression. In other words, expand, make sure that the range of hypotheses and questions and topics being covered in the academy is broadened and remains broad, right? And brings a broader diversity of ideological and intellectual perspectives into the conversation. So I've been curious since starting this initiative, what prospective students how should they approach their applications? How should they approach the conversations with the departments that they're hoping to be admitted into, given that this is part of the reason they're participating in this program. So to pick up on a point that Sean made earlier, you were saying, Sean, that just sociologically speaking, you walk into a room, it's a party, you want to, first of all, listen to what other people are saying. And to some degree, you need to fit into that conversation, right? Part of the point of our program, though, is not to just like fit in seamlessly with the existing conversation, but to eventually to expand or alter it, right? And you might say that is the aim of anyone entering the academy, but we're looking at something that might be a particular challenge here. So how would you suggest that young people think about that challenge, particularly at the application stage, which is what we're talking about today?
I completely agree with you about the importance, Jen. I agree with you. Obviously, we're all here to support this initiative very strongly. Agree with you about the importance of it. And those sociological structures of how we keep ongoing conversations do so much work to continue structuring how academia represents different perspectives. And it's part of how we produce and reinforce academic knowledge across generations. It's also part of the problem in a sense. What I would encourage students to not to necessarily forward the view of you should admit me because I will create intellectual diversity in the ranks of your graduate students. That's not actually something that is top of mind when we make evaluations. Certainly in my department, when we read files, we don't make the evaluations on that basis. It is absolutely true that the way that we make evaluations continues to reify biases in the perspectives that gets represented, but none of us think of ourselves as reading files with those glasses on. So if you tell us this is the story for why you should admit me, that is going to seem out of place and at variance with how we think about these things. So you can, raise the issues you're interested to talk about. Reference social science literature that addresses them. It's also true that nobody's asking for any particular, political leaning or ideological persuasion to be overtly expressed in these statements. So it's not necessarily important to express that one way or the other. It's important to understand what are the topics you want to study. There is surely a social science way and a political science way of approaching any of them, if they have to do with how the social world is organized and how politics creates that social world or could make it better. And so talking about those things, just sort of analytically, candidly, but directly is I think the best way to handle that in my view. But I'd love to hear other perspectives as well.
Dan?
Yeah, so I think I'm generally in agreement with Sean. I will say, we're having this conversation right now, as a lot of universities are, about, what does this mean? There's all these different phrases used, right? Intellectual vitality, intellectual diversity, viewpoint diversity, things like that. I'm most comfortable when I say, and by the way, we have 2 faculty positions open at Harvard right now that particularly have sort of a form of, call it intellectual vitality, viewpoint diversity kind of baked into the job description. A senior position in international security and a senior position in American politics. And so we're thinking about this. Harvard's doing other things, some of which are in the news, some of which are not. So these things are ongoing. I think at its most credible in part because it's really hard to define, what is a conservative? What is a liberal, particularly in this moment, where there's been just so much change in those things. I think that matters a lot less. I think a lot of what we're interested in, let me just start on the faculty point, is thinking about people whose way of doing theory, whose way of posing hypotheses, and whose way of testing hypotheses is going to challenge our established modes of thinking. That's a really important part. Like in some cases, it's purely an empiricist, and are they willing to pose hypotheses, the answers to which might leave us uncomfortable? Right? Or a lot of us uncomfortable. And you could say, well, that's just what good science does. But I agree with, I think, a general critique of American academia that there's too little. At the same time, I do want to say that I think in political science, and maybe this is being a little bit too, self-defensive. In political science, I would say there is a bit more openness to this. I remember seeing a prominent historian write in recent years, and maybe it was in the Chronicle of Higher Education, that they had a whole bunch of people writing in with their job market, their essays, their personal essays for grad school. I'm going to go in to grad school. I want to get a PhD. I want to work for social justice. I want to overthrow the patriarchy. I want to overthrow the capitalist system. Some sense of that, right? We don't see many of those, and I can guarantee you that despite all of the potential left-leaning biases of academia, those are going to go nowhere and have gone nowhere in anybody like that. And so, obviously, depending on your views, let's just say one of you here is, I want to throw the left oligarchic regime that currently governs the United States of America. That's great. Have that belief. We're not going to admit you for that purpose. But one of the things that I think is a common argument for thinking about having, say, more conservative voices, call it that, is that conservatives often study things and topics that are different from those studied by the rest of the academy. Right? International security is like just one. You're just going to get more sort of center and center-right thinking when people study bombs and rockets, right? But it's also true in people who study religion and the politics of religion, including in this context of political philosophy. People who study conservatism itself, right? People who study federalism and/or different aspects of political culture in the United States, regional, local political culture, things like that. And so I would, people who study the administrative state, things like that. So if you're interested in things like that and you just want to study them regardless of what you might happen to want to do with them, I think that's absolutely fine to say. And I would indicate that. And I wouldn't worry about, I will say this, as I've said this before, we actually have a very intellectually diverse graduate student community at Harvard. If you look at a number of people who are hired to these civics academies around the country, or even somebody like Dmitry Halikios, who was just hired at Yale, very conservative people, openly conservative, and a lot of them are coming out of our department. That's not to say I don't think we need to do more work in this space, but we have a fair bit of this, and I think other places will and do as well. But if you want to lean into kind of what your perspectives are, I think it's more that they lead you to ask different research questions, the answers to which might be troubling to many people, but I think there's more openness in this to the academy now, and that you study things that are different, and not just different, neglected. And I'll just speak as an Americanist there.
Yeah, I think that's actually really important is it's what you want to study that's the important thing to highlight, right? And often in the process of highlighting the thing you want to study with as much rigor as the subject will admit, right? Often we do signal things about what we think is important, right? How we think things work, right? So, for example, the center I ran until recently at Johns Hopkins, we did a big convening about the ideological transformation of the professions. That's a little bit about the field compression concept that Jenna was talking about. That's not just academia, but it's lots of other professional spaces. If you're sort of problematizing that and saying, look, I want to understand why this happened, and I don't just assume that it's the march of progress, right? Well, obviously, right, that's signaling something about how you think about the world, right? But presumably, you're going to tell the committee, this goes back to my structure or system thing, right? That you want to approach that as a structural systemic question, right? Where you're puzzled, where you find it not entirely obvious why that happened, right? Now, again, it's fine to say, look, I am stipulating an outcome that I find problematic and then want to understand how it came into being. Lots of people do that from the left who apply for our things, right? But the ones that work are the ones who say, I therefore like have a research strategy, right? I've determined that that thing is a thing that, is weird and unfortunate, right? And I don't know why it is, right? And I want to understand that often there's probably a very complicated explanation for that other than just like bad people did bad things, right? And so I think that's a way to kind of to square who you are, right, with what you want to do. The most important thing is to start that conversation into the thing you actually want to do, which is social science, which is different than just I want to do polemics or I want to, do denunciation, right? You are entering a profession and you want to signal that both, right, you may have criticisms of how people have done it, but you want to submit to the regime, right? You want to submit to the regime of becoming a professional, even if you're going to become a professional who'll be a critic of the profession itself. So that's kind of the balance I think to strike. All right. We never answered Hal's question. I've never heard of that. The thing where somebody signals that this is my number one, partially because I don't think anybody ever believes it, right? And everybody knows, right? We all know the game, right? That you got to apply a bunch of places. Anybody who says, I'm only in love with Wash U, and I'll never go, I could never imagine myself anywhere other than St. Louis. Like nobody believes that. So I haven't ever experienced that. It may be different in other subfields, but certainly not in American politics.
I would say it's pretty much the same for us. It doesn't matter. It doesn't carry a lot of weight if you say Berkeley is your number one choice, and it doesn't make any difference. It might make you feel a little bad about, declining an application, but not that much. What does make a difference is who you write as a potential faculty member of interest. In my department, if you put my name in a statement of purpose, the admissions committee will absolutely ask my impression of would I be interested to work with that person? And that impression is not dispositive. It's certainly if if I'm positive, if I'm affirmative, if I affirm I'm interested to work with this person, it doesn't guarantee, it doesn't in any way mean, oh, this is a sure thing, but it helps. And so that I don't know if other departments work that way or not, actually, but in our admissions process, if you put my name on that, if you put faculty member X on your statement of purpose, they will 100% be asked to weigh in by the admissions committee, and that can make a difference.
It's the same for us. I mean, it might be that if the person might be eliminated very early on, in which case, no matter whose name they mentioned, it doesn't get passed on. But assuming that they kind of go through the initial filtering, yes, if someone mentions my name, I will be asked to have a look at the application. I would add another thing though, which is I mean, I get a lot of emails from students before they've applied, and my answer to those emails is basically almost a form answer with links to all sorts of helpful advice for their application. So I wouldn't say that reaching out to professors in advance is necessary. It doesn't count against you for sure. And if you've met them at a conference or something, at a chat about research, that's a little bit different. But I think what most people will tell you at that stage is, look, we admit to the program. We don't admit to work with a particular faculty member. So that's the other side of the equation. Good to mention faculty members that you might want to work with in your statement of interest, but not necessary, and not, there's not much, at least at Stanford, potential gain to try to reach out to them by email and ask to have a Zoom chat before the admissions decisions, because what you don't see is the other side of it, which is some of us are getting just like tens or hundreds of such emails. We can't talk to everyone before the admissions cycle. It's nothing against the individual applicants.
Yeah, I think all you're signaling when you're doing that is you did your homework.
Yeah.
Right? That you, again, this goes back to my point about taking seriously that you are proposing to enter into a profession, right? And again, fields vary, right? Political theory generally tends to be more organized by schools. So if you're like, thinking that you want to become X kind of theorist, right? Then, if you haven't even like gotten the idea that this subfield is organized by schools, and then that's going to tell the committee that you haven't really done your homework, right? Again, other subfields are organized differently, but you want to say, if I'm saying I want to study race and ethnic politics using behavioral methods, then you want to at least give some signal that you know where one goes to study that. Okay, let's take another question. Anyone? Sam?
Yeah, thank you. I'm a current undergraduate, and I guess the question that I have, thank you all for getting on the Zoom call and making the time to speak with us today, is I guess, as an undergraduate, like the advantage of like taking a year or two off before applying to a program, because I think that like political science is something that I'm interested in, but I'm not 100% sure in like the benefits of taking a year off and what to do with that, because I know there's a bunch of like pre-doc programs and like RA positions and I wasn't sure just people's thoughts and advice about like what to do with all of that. Thank you.
Dan?
I would say this is I don't have a simple answer to that question, because in general there's zero penalty for taking a year and doing something non-academic. My daughter is getting her PhD in physics right now, and the only thing that I remember talking with her about this was, you let some of your high-level differential equations skills lapse in that case. I don't think that's going to be a big issue for most of us in poli-sci. Sorry, Sean. But but and there are also ways of keeping those kinds of things up. If we mentioned earlier, the advantage of learning some empirical skills. A lot of people can, if you have a laptop, you can do a little bit of programming and playing around in R if it's something that you've learned in undergrad or something like that. You can learn some new languages, right? Allison and others mentioned that earlier, Jenna. The complicated thing is, we are in a moment where there's a long-term trend, and it's not absolute and it's not universal, towards a bit of pre-professionalization in political science. So we have had some recent admits to our program who have done one of these pre-doc fellowships at places like Yale or Princeton and things like that. I don't think those make people a shoo-in. I don't think that's like a surefire bet for getting in. It does mean, though, that they've probably participated in a research study as potentially not simply a high-level RA, but also a co-author. It means they're getting their names on bylines. It means they're working with very prominent people, in part because, these people are there. So, at some level, this is not simply a matter of substitutes, but also complements. Like if you take a few years, you can take a year and, work, you can do whatever. Nobody's gonna, I think, hold it against you if you decide to take a year of travel or something like that. But there are some advantages to doing things that are a bit pre-professional in some areas. Again, I'm speaking more on the empiric side, and I'm starting to see more of that. I don't think it's. I don't want to. I don't want to reify that or just shed too much light on it, because it's not clear that that's going to be the entire future of our discipline. But in some areas, it is happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I was just up at Dartmouth seeing a former student of mine who's on a pre-doc there. In her case, I think doing that kind of thing was actually very valuable because given the kind of department we were at Hopkins, she'd read a ton, right? So she was, very familiar with all kind of literatures, but hadn't actually had as much experience actually doing empirical research, getting training. And so at Dartmouth, she went through the quantitative methods sequence and was doing some stuff, did work in public opinion that she wouldn't have done. So, a lot depends on what you're doing with that time. I do think the thing that we heard earlier that, you want, I think Allison was saying this, right? That the fact you went away and now you're coming back, maybe that gives you a little bit of an indication that you're not just doing this because you couldn't figure, that was certainly my case. I couldn't figure out anything else to do other than more school. So I kept doing more school. I'm not sure that was great. I spent at least a couple years trying to figure out what the hell I was doing as a consequence of that. But I don't think there's any general covering law. I do think, it's good if whatever you're doing with your life, right? Add some diversity to the story that you're telling them about who you are, right? That you're a rounded person, that you're not just like an idiot savant, that you've got some other, you either got some experience, you went out and saw the world, you did some work that allowed you to see something that then you want to go out and theorize that you don't think people, that you saw, but that people over in academia haven't yet learned about. I think that can be really valuable, but I don't think there's any general story about that out there. Allison?
I would just add, if you do one of those things, have a plan, a pre-doc or, something of this nature, have a plan as soon as you get there. If it's a 1-year program, 1 year goes by so extremely fast. If you start something in February, you're already past the applications, for the following PhD cycle. So you need to have something tangible, a relationship built with a letter writer, something of this nature. If it's a 1-year program, you need to have that within 2 months of starting such a program. So you have to go in with a plan to make the best use of that time. I would say it does seem to be part of how academia is changing, that we're lengthening the queue from which people transition from undergraduate student to faculty member. We have more checkpoints along the way. We have more processes that can add they reify the discipline's, norms, the way we do things. Some of it will have the effect of exactly intensifying the problems that this initiative is designed to combat, unintendedly, which is just such an interesting part of how those structures work, to recreate collective problems without anybody intending to do them, which is itself, an interesting part of what's going on
Apologies
here.
for the interruption, but that's actually a reason why AEI and Hopkins and other universities might want to consider, some kind of, pre-doc kind of program that also feeds into the intellectual diversity.
Yeah, we're on it actually. Follow up later. But the other thing I'll just say on the other side is I know I hear people who are worried that they need to hurry up and get started. And I think that's not true, right? I think it's actually great to go, work, do right. I mean, people graduate students who start later, who did other things, right? I think, often they're very good. I often met when I was at Yale Law School for a couple of years, I met like people there at the very highest who wish they hadn't gone to law school, but then they were stuck and they couldn't get out of it. And so, I do think there's really no downside, at least, especially if you're doing something good and valuable and you're learning in it. There's no downside to going and doing that, as opposed to just, doing yet another year of school in the same way you've been doing it since you were 5 years old.
I would also add one of the things you could practice if you take some time off, whether it's a pre-doc or some kind of related professional experience or even unrelated professional experience, is just the practice of having the schedule of a job. I think one of the areas where graduate students can kind of run into trouble is they kind of got away, probably because they were smart in their undergraduate careers, by having a really, let's be generous and say, flexible schedule. But one of the great things I notice about the people who have spent some time out there in the work world, we also have military applicants at Stanford as well, so they've spent some time in a very specific sort of professional experience, is they know how to work a job. And that is one of the best things you can learn in grad school, is treat this like a job. And it's sometimes going to be more than a 9 to 5 job, especially in your first couple years, and your courses are going to demand a lot from you, but you'll kind of ease into a schedule that works for you, but it should be a schedule. And it should be a conscious schedule. And you should be showing up every day, just like you'd be expected to do in any work environment. And that's a really hard thing for the people for some of the people, not all of them, but who go directly from undergraduate into doctoral programs, is just all these kind of more day-to-day professional norms of managing your time, managing your presence in your work environment, et cetera. So you can take that whatever time off you take in between. That is a great chance to practice those skills. And if you hit the ground running in grad school by treating it like a job, albeit a job with demanding hours, you will be way ahead of a lot of the other people in grad school, sadly.
All right, we're getting close to time. If anyone's got anything else they want to say quickly, Josiah?
Yeah, I'm curious for letters of recommendation. I think one thing I sometimes have trepidation of feeling like I don't know professors well enough, even though maybe they supervised my undergraduate thesis or something, and I spent quite a bit of time in their office. But I think sometimes it's hard for me to feel comfortable in that, or feel like I know where that line is, where this is someone who knows me well enough that they can write a letter on my behalf. And then maybe related to that, especially if you're a few years out of undergraduate, you've been working, and kind of reconnecting those relationships, but not doing that in a weird transactional way just to get a letter of recommendation. Just curious for your thoughts with students in the past, what that looks like done well or maybe done poorly.
That's a great question, Josiah. I would just not be bashful. At some level, it's my job to write these letters. Um, I can tell somebody if I just don't know them well enough, like they were one person in a 300-person course. I just got one of those today. Even so, if it's for law school, I can probably write something like that. For this, though, I mean, your thesis advisor, like somebody takes you on as a thesis advisor, small course, you've talked with them. At some level, it's kind of their job over the long run to write a letter for you. And if you decide to do something for a couple of years and then get in touch with them, I hate to put it this way, be as transactional as you need to be. It's always possible that there's a jerk out there somewhere who says, yeah, well, don't bother me. That's on them, not you. Just, be as appropriately selfish as you need to be and assertive as you need to be in matters like this.
Yeah, and often
Yeah, I totally agree with. Oh,
Go ahead, Sean.
Steve. No, I just be clear. I mean, somebody like Dan gets 100 emails a day, right? He's a department chair as well as, I mean, in addition to his day job. I mean, what do I need to do? Just to please tell me what you want from me. That's it. We see these very often. I understand that it's sometimes 200. It's right. I'm off by half. So you just have to be direct and very specific, not pushy. In my case, I just won't turn a student down, and I can't think of a case I will tell them the context in which I can write. If it's a single class with the student, where they were student one of 300 students, I will tell them, like, that's my experience with you, and that's what I can say. And if this is the person you want writing the letter, you need 3 letters. Okay, maybe there's some other compensating part of your file that will look really strong, but I don't tell them the content of the letter, and I don't share them with students, but I can tell them the context I can write if they need a reality check. But be direct, specific, polite, and lay the groundwork. If you've been out of school for a year or two, maybe a few months ahead of time. But we don't need to pretend like we have we don't need to meet for coffee. We don't need to have a 30-minute Zoom call, starting in August, because you need to tell me that your arc of how you're thinking about it. It's like, I get how this works, so let's just do it.
You can also, it can feel like this extremely important part of your application, your letters, is something you have no control over. And I don't think that's the right way to look at it. You do have some control. And one of the ways you can exercise that is offer to give the professor a little memo of what you think are the most important aspects of your academic background, things you want them to know. That memo could include information beyond their class, like maybe it includes an unofficial copy of your transcript as well, so they can contextualize your performance, some sense of what you want to do, some sense maybe of what you've been doing if you took time off and how that may or may not be relevant, whatever. I ask for that now as a matter of course. I don't necessarily use everything the student tells me, but it helps me to foreground the things that might be especially important from their perspective, things I might not have previously known about them. That's part of the control you can have over your own letters.
Yeah, and this is the last thing, and then we need to wrap up. But I think the more you can, again, realize what the person who's writing the letter, that this is a process they have to go through, right? You are very special. Your parents think you're very special. But, again, we offer in a writing dozens of these things. And so the more you can give them a little bit of a head start, here's what I'm interested in, here's what my other coursework is, here's why I think I'm going to be a good grad student, right? That plus the professor's experience, whatever it is with you, is a thing they can sort of weave together, as opposed to just having to be like, yeah, he was in my class and did pretty well, and sometimes he raised his hand, right? If you can add that, it's going to make it a lot easier. So I want to thank everybody. We're at time now. I want to thank everybody who helped out, and I want to encourage everybody who's listening to this to reach out to us at GSIDI, and we'll help you get through this process so you won't have to do it by yourself. So, and again, I want to thank all the professors who joined us. I appreciate it.